Deciphering the ought to, a guide to advising in English. Hello, language learners. Today, we're going to explore an important part of English grammar, modal verbs for giving advice. Specifically, we're diving into the use of ought to and ought not to. They're powerful tools that you can use to offer suggestions, give advice, or even make recommendations. So, are you ready to learn? Let's dive right in. Ought to is a modal verb phrase that we often use to say something is a good idea or to give advice. For example, if your friend asks for advice on learning English, you might say, "You ought to practice speaking English every day." It's similar to saying should, but it's a little less strong. The structure is quite simple. Subject plus ought to plus base form of verb. Here are a few examples. You ought to drink more water. She ought to study for her exam. We ought to visit our grandparents soon. Just like ought to, ought not to is also used to give advice, but in a negative form. It's a way to suggest that something is a bad idea. For instance, you ought not to stay up too late. The structure is the same as ought to, but with not in the middle. Subject plus ought not to plus base form of verb. Let's look at a few examples. You ought not to eat so much junk food. He ought not to ignore his health. They ought not to miss this opportunity. Now you might be thinking, what's the difference between ought to and should? In many cases, ought to and should can be used interchangeably. Both express advice or suggestion. However, ought to is a bit more formal and less commonly used in everyday spoken English. While you may frequently hear should in daily conversations, ought to is more likely to appear in written English or formal speeches. Now, let's do some practice. Try to make your own sentences using ought to and ought not to. Remember, the more you practice, the more natural it will become. Try giving advice to an imaginary friend, write down your sentences, or even say them out loud. And there you have it, folks. We've delved into the world of ought to and ought not to. Remember, these modal verbs are great for giving advice and making suggestions. Don't be afraid to use them in your English conversations. As always, practice makes perfect. Keep practicing, and soon, giving advice in English will feel completely natural to you. Until next time, happy learning!